Hello. Welcome to episode 8 of Nintendo Deep Dive. I am Carl. I will be your host today. For those who are newcomers to Nintendo Deep Dive, Nintendo Deep Dive is a retroactive review program. It's centered around really long-winded reviews about very old games, all of which happen to be on Nintendo systems of yesteryear. So if that sounds like something you're into, I hope you enjoy. To those who are initiated, thanks for dropping in again. And I also hope you enjoy what we have in store for episode 8. Speaking of what's in store for episode 8, there's only going to be one review, and that will be a Game Boy Color game. But it's a bigger Game Boy Color game, so I think it will fill up the show just nicely. And the aforementioned Game Boy Color game is Legend of Zelda: Oracle of Seasons. The Legend of Zelda: Oracle of Seasons. Released in 2001, first in Japan in February, then in May in North America, and then in October in the European Union, always getting last place. Oracle of Seasons was developed by Flagship, which was a middleman between Nintendo and Capcom. It was directed by Hidemaru Fujibayashi, a name that people who are into Zelda, especially recent Zeldas, should be familiar with art done by Yasuke Nakano, who by this point would be a known quantity among Zelda fans. And that seems to be all I have written down for the game's pedigree. Everyone else who worked on it was an unknown from Capcom or Flagship. So, The Legend of Zelda: Oracle of Seasons was born out of a concept to remake the original Zelda on the Game Boy Color. They then moved away from that concept to start developing the Triforce series, which was 3 games, all meant to be released at the same time. But eventually, this was condensed to the 2 Oracle games, Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons, which were released on the same day and feature many of the same assets and art style and on the same system, blah, blah, blah. But we are only specifically talking about Oracle of Seasons because these games are very different and should be talked about on their own, something which many outlets fail to do when they bring these games up, which is a great indicator that they didn't play them. As for me, I've played these games a lot. I've played Oracle of Seasons specifically 5 times now, all of which was done on the 3DS, which is a great way to play Game Boy Color games. I'm not sure playing them on the Switch will be as good, but that's not important right now. Though often touted as an action-emphasizing game, Seasons is a standard Zelda outing, featuring dungeons and an overworld, and replete with a special conceptual gimmick of its own, as is customary among Zelda titles at this time. It's definitely one of the more difficult Zelda titles, best enjoyed by more seasoned Zelda players. It's incredibly similar in aesthetics to The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening, with the visual boon of having 4 distinct color palettes for each of the seasons that the player can toggle between at will, with the Rod of Seasons whenever mounted atop a tree stump. The gist of it is this is using the Link's Awakening engine, the Link's Awakening assets. The only real difference being a lot of the character sprites are based off of Ocarina of Time characters, hence them bringing in Yusuke Nakano, though he may have been brought in for Link's Awakening, already. And the color choices are different. It's otherwise a continuation of Link's Awakening. Big thing to touch on with this game is the seasonal gimmick. The premise of the game is that some big bad man has thrown the seasons out of whack, which, would have some very serious ramifications. And Link has to put the seasons back in order. Basically, throughout the world, this very small little Zelda overworld, featuring maybe 60 or 80 screens. The seasons are occurring all at once, just in different little nooks and crannies. It's winter over here, it's autumn over there, and over yonder the hill, it's spring. So that needs to be fixed. And the way Link goes about fixing it is by obtaining the Rod of Seasons, which has the ability to control the weather. He is sent on his way by the... Goodness gracious. It's like a Deku tree, but it's not. Is it a Mako tree? I don't know. It's like the tree of Holodrum. A Deku tree, for lack of a better description, sends you on your way to obtain the Rod of Seasons, and you use that rod to change the seasons at will, though you're only able to do so if there is a tree stump at hand. And the purpose of changing these seasons mechanically is the layout of the screen that you're on changes. If there's a cave entrance that is off the ground, you can access it by changing the season to winter. And that way the snow piles up at the base of the cave entrance, providing a landing for you to walk up onto. If there's a bunch of pitfalls all over the place, if you change the season to autumn, then those pitfalls are filled with leaves and you can walk over the leaves, which must be pretty densely packed if you can walk atop them and not fall through. Certain plants come out during the summertime, or climbing vines show up in summer. Summer and spring are confusing to me because they look very similar. Either way, certain plants come out to bloom at certain seasons, and certain obstacles are circumvented by changing about the seasons. That is the big thing with this game that differentiates it from Link's Awakening. Otherwise, structurally speaking, it's very similar to Link's Awakening. You have 8 dungeons to conquer. You have a final dungeon, which isn't really a dungeon. It's kind of just like a combat palace to walk through, and then a final boss, and then the game's over. The game does have a story. It's incredibly phoned in, though, and overall unimportant. It is called Oracle of Seasons, and the Oracle of Seasons is a character whose name is Din, like one of the 3 goddesses. And she gets captured at the beginning of the game, which throws all the seasons into whack. And the person who captures her, his name is General Onyx. But the minute he's captured her, he sinks one of the temples into the ground, basically into the Earth's core. And then he sits in his residence for the rest of the game until you get to him. That's the gist of the story. Very phoned in, very unimportant, which is quite disappointing. Though, the thing about video game stories is that they often are not as good as people say they are. So the fact that the game doesn't waste time with story should be a good thing, but I think Zelda has it has a good track record of establishing a cursory narrative that enriches the experience without getting in the way of it. Of course, this is one of two games which share an overall narrative, so there's that to think about. But we're not going to talk about that till we talk about Oracle of Ages. As I touched on earlier, the game has a slight emphasis on combat, a factoid that is often overstated by lazy article writers and fans. And up until this playthrough, I had not actually noticed there being an emphasis on combat. It turns out there is, but it's not really to any great effect, I would say. Like, yeah, there's more combat in this game, but the top-down nature of it and the kinds of enemies you fight, it doesn't really matter. And it doesn't feel any different from Zelda games at this time. So when it's brought up, I'm very confused. And I'm left to think that people who bring it up, they just didn't play the Oracle games and they need to have some quick little thing to differentiate the two of them. Oh, this game is based on puzzles and this one's based on combat. This is ultimately true, but it's not actually noticeable. There's combat in Ages and there's puzzles in Seasons. If anything, most of the action element in Oracle of Seasons is based on traversal puzzles and skill-based obstacles, for lack of a better word. Precision obstacles. Shooting a thing when you're driving past it in a mine cart, or jumping from collapsible brick to collapsible brick. Pseudo-platforming, essentially. The combat, though, I guess there is more combat in this game than there is in Oracle of Ages or Link's Awakening. But again, this is something brought up by people who clearly didn't play these games. And I know people didn't play these games because they lump them together whenever they rank Zelda games. Like these games were the equivalent of Pokemon Red or Pokemon Blue. And that's not the case. These games are not equivalents. They have different things about them, entirely different content. And one game is actively better than the other. It's generally agreed upon which game is better than the other, but I'm not going to get into that now. And overall, I'm just usually annoyed by this one differentiation, even though I imagine it was promoted in the marketing. But, whatever. Game strength really isn't in its combat. It's actually in its dungeons, which have a great mix of navigation, action, platforming, traversal, and puzzles. And probably the most creative assortment of items in a Zelda game. That last point I might be overstating slightly, but there's some really great items in this game. One particular that is mind-blowingly interesting and cool. As for the overworld, to touch on it briefly before I just start dissecting the dungeons and items and whatever in Seasons, the overworld is very clearly a relic of that original notion to remake the original Zelda. The first dungeon you go into is the Gnarled Root Cave. Is that what it's called? Gnarled Root Cave? I don't know. Either way, first dungeon, different layout, but clearly inspired by the first Legend of Zelda. The entire game, in many ways, is an inspiration for the first Legend of Zelda. In that first dungeon, you fight the unicorn dragon, let's just call him that. He's a different sprite, of course, much better looking, but it's the same enemy. In fact, at least 6 or maybe 5 of the bosses that you fight in Oracle of Seasons come from the first Zelda. And the overworld itself, getting back to that, it feels like the first Zelda in that 90% of it is essentially just wilderness. There's a couple pockets of civilization to differentiate it from the original Zelda, but a lot of it feels like empty wilderness. Different layout, of course, and there's also a sub-world in Oracle of Seasons called Subrosia, which is the highlight of the game's overworld, even though it's detached from it. But otherwise, this game reminds me of the original Zelda far more than Oracle of Ages does. And given the background of its conception, it should be no surprise. But let's talk about the dungeons, as they are the game's big thing. The first two dungeons aren't particularly memorable, but by the third dungeon, it is getting going. And the first dungeon, I mean, it's okay. None of the first dungeons in top-down Zelda games are typically that interesting. So, in my experience playing this game 5 times, I did always find that getting started with this game feels really slow and uninteresting. And I often blame that on the dungeon quality of the first 3 particularly, but I don't know. I don't know why I felt that way. I played this back in December of 2022, and the dungeon quality is fine. The second dungeon is a pretty lackluster dungeon, but whatever reasons I have for the game feeling like it starts slow, I'm not sure it has too much to do with the dungeons, though they don't really get creative till level 4 or 5. Once they get going, they're very good. They are structured like Link's Awakening dungeons, not like Link to the Past dungeons. So essentially, they are the standard Zelda dungeon that people know and love, similar to the elemental dungeons in Ocarina of Time. They're not very linear. At least they're not holding you by the hand linear. There's lots of navigation in them. There's lots of setup in them. The thing I like about these dungeons is that they allow you to screw yourself, which I'll get into that later. But there's lots of prep work in these dungeons. There's lots of doing things in the proper order by the proper sequence. You can go to the wrong room early and have to backtrack out of it until you find the right room, similar to Link's Awakening. But again, at this point, very structured dungeons, like you would expect from Zelda. There's a few interesting, unique assets that these games have that other Zelda games don't have, such as mine carts and rails for those mine carts, obviously, but there's rail switches for the mine cart, so you can pass through different doors depending which way the rail is currently headed, and obviously you want to manipulate that for your own purposes. Of course, every dungeon has its own item. The first one is the Roc's Feather. Again, this is a continuation of Link's Awakening, so you have the Roc's Feather for jumping, then you get bombs, and then you don't get a bow in this game, but you get a projectile weapon, the slingshot. And you start the dungeon by having, or by not having rather, this item, and then the dungeon's pace changes once you obtain this item, which is not something that even later, older Zelda titles did. Like, I find that Skyward Sword and maybe Twilight Princess, certainly Wind Waker, they really wouldn't lead you to rooms where you didn't need the item, typically. But these dungeons, to describe them a little better, they are about path finding, not path following. So you can trek forward into rooms where you are out of sequence. And I enjoy that. So that's what kind of dungeons they are. There's a lot of navigation in them, but also puzzles, and there is a logic to the layout of everything. Though one important thing to bring up about these dungeons, and I've already alluded to it, is the uniqueness of the items in the dungeons and in this game. Most of the items you get have to do with traversal. They don't manipulate specific objects, or they don't help you with very specific puzzles. They are just about movement. And so there's a lot of platforming in Oracle of Seasons. The first item you get is the Rock's Feather, which helps you jump. Eventually that upgrades to the Rock's Cape, which helps you jump and glide at least 3 tile spaces as opposed to 1, perhaps 4 tile spaces even. You get the Magnet Mitts, which are loved by very, very many people, I imagine. Anybody who knows about them likes them. And they have a polarity of function to them, which allows an object to be pushed away from you or pulled towards you. Or in the case of fixed objects, it allows you to push away or pull towards these fixed objects to the point that you can actually fly across gaps by using these magnet gloves. And there's puzzles and things that they do with them that are very, very cool. It's one of those items that has big ramifications, and they actually make good on those ramifications. The Magnet Mitts are the highlight of this game as far as items go. And then you have other items. Again, it's about kind of precision use, like the slingshot, which uses different kinds of seeds, which I'll talk about the seeds later. Or I'll talk about them now. I'm not sure about Link's Awakening. I don't believe there's different kinds of seeds in Link's Awakening. But in the in the Seasons games, they introduce different kinds of seeds. One can help you teleport. One can make you run fast. And it's not like a dash run like the Pegasus boots. It's just your general movement is quicker. There's seeds that set things on fire. And you can either drop them onto things or you can fire them with your slingshot. So you have to hit eyeballs or switches as you would expect. There's also the magic boomerang, which is controlled in a way that once you throw it, you can determine its trajectory with the D-pad. Those are the sorts of items that you get in this game, in addition to bombs and I don't know. There's an item I'm missing, but it's probably not important. So a lot of the dungeon obstacles you run into have to do with using, these items naturally. And so there's lots of jumping across big gaps. There's lots of platforming of a kind. There's also the return of those 2D sections from Link's Awakening, which I'm more than happy about. I really like that visual differential. It breaks up the pace of the aesthetic in a way that I enjoy. But I'll talk about, specific uses of these items for specific instances that I found enjoyable later on. As for interesting fixtures found within these dungeons, things to differentiate them from other Zelda games, you have mine carts and rail systems, which I've already brought up. Basically, you jump in a minecart and it will go through a door that can only be opened when there's a minecart passing through that door. And you can change which door you pass through on the minecart by hitting switches, either with a sword or with a projectile weapon. Those are the minecarts. So there can be some setup with how you navigate the dungeon with these minecarts. Other things still, let me think here. Oh, there's trampolines, which the trampolines are funny in that they're pretty shallow. The way you use them is you jump on them and they will boost Link to the next floor if there is a hole for him to get through that floor. If you position the trampoline wrong, usually there's some indicator on the floor where you should position it, or it's by rote memory if you've been to the top floor previously. If you position it wrong, there's just kind of what is it? It's not a vibration. Maybe it's an audible cue, but you hit your head on the ceiling and then you come back down. No damage done. It's just a little slap on the hand telling you to position the trampoline correctly. Most of the enemies and obstacles otherwise are from Link's Awakening. The one thing that's not in Link's Awakening that is entirely unique to the Oracle games, and so unique and so interesting in quotes, I enjoy it, but it's not interesting to explain. But I will explain it because it is entirely unique to the Oracle games. That is the turnstiles. As I already said, they are a fixture wholly unique to the Oracle duology. These circular gates, positioned at four-way merge points, present a compelling navigational conundrum for the player. Upon entering through a gate, Link will be revolved 90 degrees and then spat out onto the pathway placed before him. Should he turn around and enter the turnstile again, it will revolve 90 degrees the opposite direction, spitting him back out onto the pathway he originally approached the turnstile from. An action that one would consider wasteful. The turnstile itself can be colored either blue or orange, with revolving blinking lights to indicate current direction of revolutions. The trick with these gates is to either circumvent them entirely in order to approach them from a more suitable direction, or to toggle/manipulate them by changing up their revolutions by entering through them to then access the desired path forward with further circumvention.
Right, yes. Well, we should circumvent union penalties.
Circumvent. Means to go around.
The old reach around it.
That's what I have written down for these turnstiles. If it didn't make any sense, well, that's as much sense as I could make of them, descriptively speaking. Initially, they are quite intimidating from a navigational perspective, because that's what they are. They are a navigation puzzle. I should be clear that when you manipulate the turnstile, it is a action of continuity. So long as you are in that dungeon, if you manipulate the turnstile by walking through it, it will keep the way it was even if you leave the room. So that's the trick with it, or it can be. Sometimes you can just leave them alone and deduce where you should go in order to approach them in a way that's suitable to your purposes. If you want to get to the upper path and the gate is spinning counterclockwise, you want to walk through it to make it spin clockwise, so then you can walk down and then to the left, or to the left, or the doesn't matter, to the left or the right, and then you would come upon the left. It doesn't matter where you're coming up from, but then you can approach from the right quadrant of the turnstile, and because it's spinning clockwise, none of this matters, and I'm just confusing myself. Basically, if you want to it doesn't matter. Sometimes you want to manipulate the gate to have it spin a certain way because that's the only way that path is accessible. Other times you don't, and it's not necessary. And if you do manipulate it and when you didn't need to, you are screwing yourself, which is a faucet of this game and older Zelda games. Not permanently, you're not breaking the game. Anyway, that's what I have to say about the turnstiles. And I'm going to leave all that mumbo jumbo where I screw up directions in because, it speaks to this sort of thought process that is required with these turnstiles and how easy it is to screw up said thought process. Now, getting to some highlights of the dungeons, a lot of it comes down to the way the items are used in them. And the best item in the game is the magnet gloves, which the magnet gloves, as I said, they have a polarity mechanic to them. If you hit the button once, the whatever button you have the item assigned to, there's only two in this game, because it is on the Game Boy, so there's only 2 buttons to use. And they're not animals. They're not going to use the select button like Donkey Kong Land 2 did. But anyway, you hit the button once, and then you hit it again. And as you hit the button with the magnet gloves, the polarity changes naturally. And if you want to use the given polarity, you hit and hold the button, and that will keep the magnet glove itself active. In some cases, and most of this is in the Unicorn Cave, which is a highlight of this game on account of the fact this is where you find the magnet gloves, which are wonderful. Actually, I think it's just one magnet glove. You don't have 2, but anyway. First thing you can do with it is there's a metal ball. You can push it away from you, crushing enemies, or pushing it onto a switch, or you can pull it towards you. You would then take one of these metal balls, and if there's a bunch of spear launchers on the far wall that are, shooting spears to purely for the intent of impaling you, you can then use the magnet to grab the metal ball, and then you're using it as a shield. Or you can push it away from you to block a flamethrower launcher or spout. Whatever you call a fixture in a wall that's shooting flames. So you can use the metal ball as a shield of some kind, either as a stationary shield or a mobile shield, just holding it with you as you walk to the left or the right or forward and back. There's also platforming with the magnet gloves where once you activate them, Link will levitate. He won't lose any altitude or gain any altitude. He will move perfectly laterally however he is moving. If you are using the same polarity as I don't know how you describe it. There's these copper poles, or these copper bricks. They're not copper though, but they have the word S written on them, saying that the polarity is south as opposed to north. If the gloves are in the north polarity, they will pull you towards the giant copper-colored brick. If they're south, it will propel you from. And so you can be crossing a chasm 10 tiles wide by sucking onto this pole. Or if you want to cross a chasm by pushing away from the pole, you would then switch the polarity back to south, and then you'd push yourself backwards facing across a chasm. And of course, if you don't have any footing while you're doing this, once you turn the magnetic field, let's call it, off, you'll just fall into the chasm immediately. There is no... Well, that's not true, actually. There's like a split second for you to switch between polarities. If you're quick, you won't fall to your death, but you're only going to be able to move in straight lines back and forth. You can't change your directions outright. Unless the thing that you are grabbing onto with the magnetic gloves is a thing that rotates on its own. And there are points in the game, points of magnetism, that will actually self-rotate. And so you can pull yourself towards them with the right polarity. And then when they've rotated into the proper position, you propel yourself away from them. And you can I believe you can chain together a bunch of different levitation actions with these multiple revolving magnetic points. I might be wrong on that, but there's some extended platforming with these magnet gloves, is my point. And it's super, super fun. And then there's a boss in the level 5 dungeon, the Unicorn Cave. And all you do with that boss is you take a giant metal spike ball and you push it towards yourself and pull it away from yourself. Or the reverse of those two actions. You know what I mean. So you can either push it away or pull it towards you, all for the sake of crushing this giant bouncing eyeball blob with this spike ball. And you can self-inflict harm It's a weird way to say that, but you can harm yourself by pulling this giant spiked ball into yourself too, so you have to be worried about that. The boss visually is very uninspired, but it's one of the best bosses in the game because of the act of using these magnet gloves to just push and pull this giant ball as your primary way to kill said boss. There's also the Rocks Cape, which is a lot of fun to use. The interesting thing about it is you can move in straight lines or you can move in L's, the shape of an L. And it's a little hard to get good with that L shape. I think it's one of those Tetramino shapes where it's a zigzag, essentially. You can move in zigzags with the Rocks Cape so long as your gliding ability lasts. And so there's a lot of fun utilizing that. It's not as fun as using the magnet gloves, though you might be able to use these two things in tandem. Don't quote me on that. I might be wrong on that. Doesn't matter. And then using the magic boomerang is pretty fun as well because you can remote control it, which it's always fun to remote control a projectile. Of course, when you're in the mine carts, there's lots of shooting switches. Sometimes multiple switches with the slingshot when you're going through a minecart and you have to switch the track at the last second. There is puzzles too, though. There's very good puzzles in Oracle of Seasons. One of my favorite ones, and I like it so much that I'm happy to be in this dungeon just because of this one puzzle. And I'm not even sure if I can remember the rest of the dungeon without it. I think there's lots of lighting torches, because if you don't light them, then the Poe knocks the torch out, and then you have to restart at the beginning of this dungeon being Explorer's Crypt, level 7. Either way, unimportant. The puzzle I really like in this dungeon, it involves these Armos statues that slide around, and you don't push them. You move them in rows, in a maximum of 3 at a time, by hitting these pressure switches on the ground. So the gist of what you want to do is there is in the singular, a 3x3 grid of blue tiles, with the tile in the very middle being a green tile, I believe, or just empty. Doesn't matter. So there's 8 tiles in this 3x3 grid, and there's 8 statues. Naturally, you just surmise that you need to position them on all of these blue squares. And as I said, the way you move them is by hitting these switches on the ground. And any statue, what would be the word, in line with this switch will move with it. I really shouldn't explain this entire puzzle, but basically you manipulate these statues, these Armos statues, to get a key or a compass. I think it's a key. I wouldn't bother with a compass. And it's a very smart puzzle. And you have to figure out the sequence, of which buttons you press in order to position these Armos statues in the right way that they occupy the proper spaces that they need to occupy. That's a very, very smart cerebral puzzle in this action game, which, again, this game is a standard Zelda game. It's a little harder than other Zelda titles. I feel like only hardcore Zelda fans really play the Oracle games, but they were popular in their day. But nowadays, you kind of have to be into Zelda to play these Zelda games, these particular ones, because kind of out of sight, out of mind, and they're a little more difficult. But there's lots of good puzzles in the Seasons game, a lot of which have to do with navigation, and also which have to do with more cerebral things like the puzzle I just mentioned. One of the bigger highlights in the dungeons with Oracle of Seasons, and I should mention this, is the Sword and Shield dungeon. It could be was going to make a very vague statement that accomplishes nothing. It could be one of the best Zelda dungeons ever. It is one of the best Zelda dungeons ever. It's very good. It's very thematically appropriate, where you have the first floor, which is shaped like a European longsword with the quillons and everything. And when I say the first floor, I mean the layout of the structure is shaped like a sword. So there's some very cheap but entertaining thematic motifs there. And then the second floor is shaped like a shield, at least the outline of the shield, with the shield boss in the center of it. But the thematic motifs of that dungeon go past just a layout of the structure. There's a thing they do where the top floor, which is the sword, is made out of... Oh, now I'm confused. Maybe the bottom floor is the sword. The bottom floor, which is the sword portion of the dungeon, is comprised of hot rooms. There's lots of lava in the first floor. And the second floor, which is the shield, is comprised of ice. So you have this nice interplay of colors between fire and ice, blue and red. And the way that you solve that dungeon, I'm not going to get into too much detail, but you have to bring the top floor to the bottom floor in order to get to the boss door. And that involves taking these very, very cold, they must be very cold, ice crystals or ice formations. I don't know. You can pick them up and carry them around, and you can use the mine carts to transport them as well. And you have to ultimately take those giant blocks of ice and solidify the lava in the floor below with them. And there are certain points, holes in the floor, by which you can do that. And that's a very great dungeon, not only for all this thematic stuff, but there's a lot of navigation work required where you have to set up all the railways by which you would use the mine carts to get to these certain points in which you can throw the ice blocks down into the lava below. You have to set up the railways in a certain way. Certain portions of this floor below, which is all lava, will solidify, but it only opens up certain parts of the dungeon, I guess. And so you have to figure out which pathways that has opened up. So there's lots of navigation and there's lots of setup in the Sword and Shield dungeon. And, the concept of, throwing ice to cool lava is just innately pleasing too, visually speaking. And the thematic motifs of ice and fire, defense and offense, they're also quite... enthralling's a strong word, but they engage you throughout. So that final dungeon really exemplifies what great dungeons Oracle of Seasons has. And that is what Oracle of Seasons has going for it. It also has really good bosses. A lot of them are retreads of the original Zelda game with differentiators. For instance, with Gleeok, when Gleeok comes back, his heads fly off as you cut them off and they continue to wreak havoc. But there's a second phase where he causes the floor to shake, which, what's the word? Unsteadies Link, for lack of a better word, leaving him vulnerable to be attacked as he takes a while to pick himself up. So you have to use the Rock's Cape. Apologize for the stutter. You have to use the Rock's Cape to keep off the floor whenever he's shaking the foundations of it. And the fights in general with the bosses are good because they're more about sticking and retreating, I guess, avoiding and then getting in there when you have an opportunity. It's not like the 3D Zelda games where there's this pattern that you follow where... Because I just like to bring this one up where, wait till the boss gets his sword stuck in the pillar and then slash him on the butt when he's done that and then redo that because he's otherwise invulnerable if you don't do it that way. There's no vulnerability phase that comes at certain points in the boss fight. The bosses are typically always vulnerable, and you also are always vulnerable. So it's a matter of who kills who quicker, rather than being this stilted, contrived thing, which I like some of those contrived fights a lot. And when you do those fights right, they're probably more crowd pleasing than just the more simple stick and weave, or stick 'em and retreat, whatever you want to call that sort of Link to the Past sort of boss fight. But as a general rule, the more combat intensive fights where you just kill the boss with a sword, those are consistently more enjoyable on the whole, I find. And Oracle of Seasons is replete with those styles of boss fights. So I really enjoy that, which, could make the argument for, oh, it's a more action-oriented Zelda game. It's like, sure, whatever you want to say. I'm sure the director of the game himself put it that way, but it doesn't make it a huge deal. It's just one feature of many in this game. So I've spent a lot of time on the dungeons in this game, which is appropriate because that is the best thing about Oracle of Seasons. Everything else in the game doesn't really deserve that much airtime, frankly. It's not that it's super terrible, it's that it's not particularly good. And I'm not making a blanket statement. There are good things about the overworld and the music and the visuals and the story to a degree. Less so the story, though. But it's not as consistently strong. So we'll just talk about all of that. Starting with the overworld. This game has a very weak overworld with unmemorable characters and unmemorable locales, and it's mostly a lot of generic wilderness. There's one place in this land of Holodrum. Holodrum, doesn't matter. There's one town in a Holodrum that's called the Flooded City. And it's a very poor city because there's maybe 4 buildings in what could be 4 screens of real estate. And it's an interesting enough place, but it kind of goes to my point where everything is more or less wilderness in Oracle of Seasons, which isn't innately a bad thing. And again, this is kind of playing off the original Zelda game. But I find that the rugged wilderness nature of the original Zelda works for that game because there's a lot more intrigue and crypticness. The secrets in that game are very secretive, so everything being unadorned, unassuming works. This game, it's just a lot of empty space, and anything that's interactable is pretty noticeably so. So it's just not an engaging place to be. Holodrum. There's one place you go to. It's like the river or the creek or whatever it's called. One of the dungeons is situated here. It's just a river that goes into a lake that then connects to the waterways of the center of the map. There's nothing going on there. There's a house with a kangaroo in it. The main village. The theme of it is actually coming to me, which I'm very surprised by because I can't remember a single thing about this locale usually. And for the same reasons, there's a couple houses all spread out. The center is a fountain, the center of the village. which I don't know what the village is called. Holodrum Village, I'm assuming. I don't know, it's a lot of wasted space, and it doesn't strike me as being particularly memorable, like whatever the village in Link's Awakening is called, which it's not like that village is super memorable either, but it's more memorable than this one. The locales, my point is that the locales are not memorable. As for the characters, it's really the same thing. Most of the characters exist for the trading quest, which I need to talk about the trading quest a little later on, and how, I don't want to say disappointing it is, but for me specifically, it was disappointing for one very peculiar reason. But most of the characters just exist to take part in the trading quests, which first appeared in Link's Awakening and then carried on into Ocarina of Time. It's not mandatory like Link's Awakening, at least the degree to which it was mandatory in Link's Awakening anyway. It's fully optional, but the characters, they exist to fulfill that role, typically. Some of the characters are more interesting than others. There is a crew of skeleton pirates, which are submerged in the land of Subrosia. I think they fell into a sinkhole in the desert, and Subrosians themselves are interesting, and I'll talk about them in a little bit. But the main overworld, there's some characters that you've seen from Ocarina of Time, such as the Music Man with the megaphone. He's there. What's he doing there? I don't know. He's part of the trading quest. Anyway, the characters, not super interesting. There is one interaction with the characters. It involves the Moblin King. I think he's called the Moblin King. And once you oust him out of his fortress by blowing up his bomb stash, he's in this little house in the flooded city, and he's just stockpiling his big bombs. And should you decide to plant one of your little bombs by his stash of bigger bombs, the entire house goes up right down to the foundations. He gets very sad about it, and then he and his cronies leave, and he's, usually he's sad already in that house. He's just crying about, being ousted. He's a pathetic figure. And you can leave that screen and come back, and they've built that house again, and this time it's all cracked and stuff, like it was blown up and just shoddily put back together, and you can re-blow it up and just keep doing that. Though, let's just say the interaction will eventually change as you keep blowing up his house, his sad little home, where he's stockpiling his big bombs. That's an example of a good interaction. Every other character, though, it's not just like what they say, it's how they're situated. There's one place in this game where there's a bunch of Gorons in the western north quadrant of the map, and they're in the mountains. But the mountains themselves aren't really mountains. It's not like Tal Tal Heights. There's like a small mountain range that's very unremarkable, and there's a few Gorons in the caves of those mountains, and also Big Goron is there too. And he's peering over the cliffside like he typically does, and he's a nice looking sprite. But the rest of the Gorons, they don't live there. There's no indication that they live in those mountains. They're just standing around in an empty cave, and that's it. Like, it feels very quaint and underdeveloped, the abode that they're in. It's not like Goron City and Ocarina of Time. And in Oracle of Ages, they actually do have a city that they live in. These might just be traveling Gorons, but it doesn't look like they're traveling. It just looks like they're sitting around in an empty cave. There's no shops, living arrangements, nothing. It's just a cave with some Gorons in it, which feels like it's indicative of a lot of the overworld and the denizens within it. There is one highlight to the overworld, though, and that is actually not part of the overworld, not the main overworld. It's detached from it, and that is Subrosia, which you can enter via... well, I think there's only really one way to enter it, but anyway... there's two ways to enter it, that one of which doesn't require these warp points. But for the most part, you enter Subrosia via warp points, and Subrosia is technically underneath Holodrum. Like it's a subterranean land from the looks of it. And so everything is lit in a dark red, like you're in a cavern, I guess. I assume that's the logic of it. Like you're in a magma core, because there's no water in Subrosia. It's all boiling magma. I presume it's magma anyway. You can't jump into any of it. It will burn you to death. So it's lava of some kind. And Subrosia is populated by Subrosians, which are these hooded creatures with big gleaming eyes emanating from their hoods, and that's their only visible feature. Basically, they're like a Jawa. They're not short like them, but they're like Jawas, and they live in this underground red place. And Subrosia is pretty interesting overall. Everybody who lives in Subrosia, there's a couple people standing around, but there's lots of shops and locations, and you get this notion that they're a smithing people, kind of like Dwarven in a sense. And so there's lots of different shops that you go to and things you buy from Subrosians and whatever. And the way the game works is the Temple of Seasons has sunk right down into the earth, and so it's landed in their little place, in their little town. And so in order to unlock the different seasons that you can use with the Rod of Seasons, you have to go to Subrosia, and you have to access the temple throughout the game. And as you unlock items, you are able to access it better as it goes, in typical Zelda fashion. You unlock more seasons to use, and that is the main progression through the overworld. That's Subrosia. It's more interesting than the world above it, certainly. One of the characters plural, by the way, that you meet in Subrosia is the pirates, who all seem to be dead, or I presume they're dead because they're all skeletons. Except at one point, one of the pirates is a skeleton ghost, so somehow he died twice, or is more dead than the other dead skeletons. So the nature of their subsisting is questionable. But you help the pirates get out of Subrosia at one point, which is a fun quest. And here's an interesting thing about the narrative. Should you beat Oracle of Ages prior to playing Oracle of Seasons, you actually get a more extended background with the pirates, where the story actually becomes more at the forefront than it usually is. And that's one of the instances where using the passcode system between these games, which is not something I've brought up yet, but I will get into it, is quite exciting. The implications of it anyway. And so overall, Subrosia is cool, and the pirates in Subrosia are themselves interesting NPCs, specifically when you play Oracle of Ages first. But even without that, one of the more interesting NPCs in the game. Of course, Zelda worlds are more than just NPCs and locations. They are also mini games and treasures and quests and all of that, whether optional quests or critical path quests. And in this way, Oracle of Seasons is still not that memorable. I find that a lot of Seasons is comprised of distractions, and they aren't the sort of distractions that are time consuming, and they're not bad. They're just a little half baked. And the nature of them is that they are harmless. So if you enjoy doing them, then you do them. And if you don't enjoy doing them, then you don't do them. No harm, no foul. But I think there is a little bit of harm in having half-baked ideas that first kind of distract you from what you're doing, and they distract you in so much as you want to see what the greater ramifications of these distractions are. And then when you find out that there really is no greater ramifications, even if you haven't spent time on these things off to the side, you've spent, for lack of a better word, engagement. You have become engaged with something to then disengage with it in a way that was deflating. And that takes some energy away from you when you play games where there are just certain things that don't really pan out. And there's some leeway with this, with games. Like, not everything has to be super exciting in the optional content. That's why it's optional. It's there to waste time because you want to waste time. But I find a lot of the stuff in Oracle of Seasons, and by extension in Oracle of Ages, is just not that well conceived, even though it sounds cool in concept. One of the things that you find in both of these games is these animal friends, which, if you're reading Hyrule Historia, which a lot of why I got excited about the Oracle games is because of Hyrule Historia, now that I think of it. But if you're reading that, you see these very interesting characters in the Oracle games. Ricky the kangaroo, Dimitri the Dodongo. I think he's a Dodongo, but he swims. So I didn't know Dodongos swim, but he looks like a Dodongo. Dimitri the Dodongo. Ba 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 ba. And Moosh the flying bear. All very interesting characters. At the end of the day, though, you interact with them for maybe 20 minutes apiece, and then you never see them again. You can see one of them if you get their instrument, but by getting one instrument from these animals, you then lose the ability to gain the next instrument from the other two, or something like that. So whichever one you visit first gives you their flute or whatever, and then you can summon them with that. But the other two animals you won't ever see again. It seems like you won't anyway, until you play the other Oracle game. The point is that these animals, they look cool, and maybe I got excited about them preemptively in Hyrule Historia, but they don't actually amount to much. In the same way, the ring system doesn't amount to much. And part of the ring system is the gacha seeds, which you can get things in Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons by planting gacha seeds. And then you get a gacha tree, and then a gacha fruit will grow from the branches of that tree, and then you chop it down, and then you might get a heart piece, 100 rupees, or some other kind of treasure in this tree. But typically what you're going to get is a ring, which is a nice addition. But outside of a few rings, most of them have no purpose. They're very gag heavy, the rings. One of the rings turns you into a moblin. One of them turns you into an Octorok. One of you may turn you into a like. Or one of them may turn you into a Subrosian. And that's cute and all, running around as these characters, and somebody might find more value in that than I do. But there's no actual function to masquerading as these characters. You don't fool any of the enemies, and they continue to attack you, and you can't even use your sword or items when you're these characters. The act of equipping these rings is a little tedious too, so You're not going to be wanting to change rings very often in the game. So once you've found a ring that's good, you typically want to stick with it. For the rings that are useful, they're only useful in very specific use cases, like one ring halves your damage from falling boulders, but there's only a few places in the game where boulders are ever falling, so not that useful. Another ring makes you immune or less susceptible to be electrocuted by, oh gosh, what are those called? Choo-choos or chews. I think they're just called chews. I'm a real Zelda fan. I remember what they were called. And one of them, probably the more useful one, makes your physical attacks more potent, though it costs you your defense. And then another ring, vice versa. There's many rings, so it's a big thing to get into, and it extends the playtime of the game, but the end result of it is you are wandering around a lot in this very plain overworld, looking for trees that you've planted to obtain rings, which may or may not give you something useful. And there are a number of duplicate rings as well. It's one of those distractions that, while it's harmless and you can choose to engage with it or not engage with it, a lot of the game's optional side stuff is built around it. But the end result, both extrinsically and intrinsically, is uninteresting. There's also a trading side quest, which the thing about the trading side quest is you don't actually need to do it, on account of the fact that the trading side quest doesn't give you an item. It gives you information in obtaining the item, which is information that I already had from playing this game, and I either looked it up on the internet because I'm a cheater, or I found it on accident. And I just know this information, and that's, I'm not going to spoil it, but you can obtain a certain item which significantly boosts your damage and is all around useful by obtaining information through the trading side quest, which, here's the crazy thing, the information you get to obtain this item is actually very vague anyway, so that information might not even be useful to you, which is also kind of a kick in the nards. In fact, I am certain this by accident, but I found this item without that information by just deduction, because it's put in a place where you are, well, it's like a Lost Woods sequence in the Tarm runes. And when you're there, you know, you're running around trying to figure out what to do. And one of the characters will tell you what to do. But, you know, while you're getting lost, it's very likely that you might do the thing that I did in order to obtain this item, which is, and I'm not going to spoil it, even though I almost just did. But the act of obtaining this item, even without that information, is very doable. So I never did the side quest of the trading sequence. And then I finally did. And my reward was an item that was already in my possession at this point in the game anyway. I'm like, oh, well, that's incredibly lame. As for Oracle of Ages, what do you obtain for doing this trading sequence? I might do it still, but either way, it's not necessary to do, and it's not as fun as doing it in Ocarina. Talking to each of these NPCs, just, I don't know. It's not engaging or interesting, and it can be time consuming. And there's no reward in it if you're already inured with this information. So that's the overworld. There's not really much more to say about it. There's no really good mini games in it either, from what I remember. I'm sure there's a few, or one or two. I have no idea. Not sure there is mini games in this game. There's one dancing mini game that's also in Oracle of Ages. That's quite stressful. The quests, like the critical path quests that you get in this game, they're of mixed result. The one where you help the pirates is pretty good. The one where you throw a bomb in a volcano and it fills the entire overworld above with lava, that one's pretty entertaining. There's like a really long drawn out one, which is you kind of expect a bit of padding in Zelda games, these older ones. So you get one that has a lot of padding, the one where you have to get to Tarm Runes and then into the 6th dungeon. I don't know the point I was making with it. There's just one sequence between dungeons that is intentionally padded, but it's also kind of amusing that it's there. Honestly, not much to say about the main quests or the side quests in the overworld. The main quests are certainly better than the side quests, but they're a little so-so. And the visuals of this game are also so-so. For a game that looks almost exactly like Link's Awakening, which is an art style I really like, I'm amused and confused by how much less I like the look of Oracle of Seasons. It's not bad looking, but it's mostly a neutral, which is bad because Zelda has so many enchanting aesthetic choices throughout the series, including Link's Awakening, but for whatever reason, this game, it's not doing it. It's not lighting those parts of my brain up. And I think it has a lot to do with color choices. I think the game is a bit garish and gaudy looking. That must be it. And it certainly is more vivid than something like Link's Awakening, which Link's Awakening used very soft color palettes. And I think with the simpler art style, that really benefited Link's Awakening. There's something a little childlike about how that game looks. Not as childlike as the remake, which is a step too far, but it's like nursery colors, as I would describe it. The soft earth colors for the cliffs and Tal Heights and softer greens for the grass, whereas Seasons, a lot more vivid coloring, and I don't think it benefits the game. Like, I think about the dungeons in Seasons too, and I can't really visually remember them, as cool as I say they are. From a visual perspective, outside of Sword and Shield, and maybe one other one, I just don't have a visual memory of them. It's all mechanical. Whereas Link's Awakening, this isn't going to be mind-blowing or earth-shattering, but Link's Awakening, a lot of the dungeons I can remember because they had very specific color palettes, almost muted, but Catfish Maw comes to mind, where there's lots of green highlights, like the walls and the bricks that you push around are green, and then the floor is like a softer yellow. And then in Face Cave, level 6, whatever you want to call it, the Face Dungeon, I believe it's called. They go for more of a red sandstone look, and then you get into Eagle's Tower, and I can't remember the palette they use specifically, but it's a lot of like pale gray and paler blue to denote a stone structure like a castle. And there's more to it than that, like the layout of these dungeons, but just the colors in Link's Awakening, I can just pull those dungeons out in my memory. Whereas Seasons, I can't do that at all. Not in their aesthetic. And same with the rest of the game. I just find the aesthetic to be not very purposeful and not very good to look at. For people who love autumn, and many people love autumn, they'll really enjoy this game because you can just climb atop any stump and change the palette to an autumn palette, which, you know, is a big boon to the game if that's a weak point for you or a weakness in you that you love autumn so much. But I find the aesthetic despite being exactly the same as Link's Awakening, far less effective. Even if in actuality the differences are minor. It might be a little subjective, which a lot of things I say are subjective, but normally I feel like I have a much more readily apparent reason for why I don't like something, but I'm pretty sure it's the color choices of Seasons is gaudy, and also the way everything's arranged just isn't very iconic, from the dungeons to the locales. And then there's the story, which is also very phoned in, so it's really a matter of personality when it comes to Oracle of Seasons. I think the game, to start summing up, is a perfect example of a game made perfectly within the template of Zelda, mechanically speaking. But in terms of personality, it's not really doing it. Music-wise, it's also pretty lackluster. The only musical track I can think of in this game, well, that's not true, not the only one, but the one that I like specifically is Tarm Runes, and that's one that everybody likes. And I'm sure I'm going to play it in a moment here. But Tarm Runes is the track of this game. Everything else, it's just not melodically interesting. On a positive note, though, the final boss of this game is very good. He might be the hardest boss in all of Zelda. Maybe the original boss is kind of hard because he's hard to understand, or there's some bosses in Zelda 2 that could be more difficult, certainly. Aside from those, though, there's no other boss I can think of that's actually more difficult than Onyx. Trying to outrun him when he's shooting flames at you when he's the dragon, he changes up his trajectory pretty quick, so you gotta be really nimble in that section. But you fight him and he starts out as a iron knuckle form, essentially, and he's got a flail or a ball and chain, more accurately, that he's throwing around at you, similar to that enemy in Link to the Past. And it progresses from there, where you have to use the Rod of Seasons to move a friendly character out of the way before you continue to attack him. That phase is whatever. But then the game, it gets really hard when he turns into a dragon. And he's a very impressive looking dragon sprite. He doesn't have legs, but he has arms and wings. Interestingly enough, it is a side-scrolling boss fight where you move left to right, and appropriately there's a lot of platforming with killing General Onyx, where when he tries to flat hand smush you, you then jump onto the back side of his hand when he's raising it up, and then you have to use a combination of spin attack and the Rocks cape. Almost called it the Rocks robe. The Rocks robe, that sounds fun. Using a combination of jumping and floating while also unleashing a spin attack, you hit him on the face. It's all pretty simple. You just hit him on the jewel just above his eyes. It's easy to screw up too, though, and he really beats the tar out of you if you're not careful. Very hard boss fight, very enjoyable, it's not complicated, but the act of perfecting doing it is very exciting, and it's a very good final boss. And it's a nice way to cap off Oracle of Seasons. last thing I would mention about Oracle of Seasons is, of course, the password system. And the password system, it's a bit cumbersome, but it does have some interesting rewards and ramifications. For one thing, the story of Oracle of Seasons was considerably improved. And by considerably, I mean a fair bit, by having used the password system. Like, a bit of interesting character interaction happened on account of the interplay between ages and seasons. And there's also rewards that you get, which are, they're nice. I think if you beat seasons and then you go to ages, you get an extra heart. So you're one heart closer to getting a full health bar. And these games are pretty hard, so, you know, hearts are definitely something you want to be on the lookout for. There's other things too. If you talk to one mayor in one town and one mayor in the other, and one mayor gives you a secret, you get a ring box, or is it a ring box, or all your rings from the previous game transfer over, or they do that naturally anyway between the ring jewelers. So there's lots of interesting things. It's a little bit of work to type in all these different passcodes, but I like this interaction between these two games. It makes for an interesting question of which game do you play first and which one do you play second. There's also this mystery oracle who has secrets, which I think if you tell her certain secrets, I'm not really doing really good with that word. Secrets are no fun. Secrets hurt someone. Anyway, there's an oracle of secrets, and you can tell her certain secrets which manifest or do something, or I actually have no idea what you do with her. So I haven't even figured that out. So there's one level of intrigue that remains beyond me, even though I played this game 5 times. So passcode is a positive, certainly. And, you know, that might be all I have to say about Oracle of Seasons, which I can't believe I filled 2 hours talking about it. As for what numerical value out of 10 I would ascribe, prescribe, describe, one of those, to Oracle of Seasons, I'm juggling between a 7.5 and an 8. When I started writing down my thoughts, the game was an 8. After I finished writing them down, it was a 7.5. I find a lot of the problems I described with this game to be not really problems, they're just things that I wish were better. And then the things that are good about this game require a lot of skill and know-how in a way that's not amateurish. There's lots of things that come together in this game that lesser developers wouldn't be able to pull off. Though a similar thing was true of Skyward Sword. Like, the dungeons in Skyward Sword are quite impressive, which I should bring this up. The fella, Hidemaru Fujibayashi, he is the director of Skyward Sword, and he is the director of Breath of the Wild and presumably Tears of the Kingdom. So this guy who started on Flagship, he is Mr. Zelda now. He took over from Eiji Aonuma more than 12 years ago, which is a little bit of interesting trivia. And he's a great designer in a lot of ways. So, in one sense, I mean, I feel like this game is so much more impressive than so many other Game Boy games that I've played. And in fact, when I started playing Game Boy, the first Game Boy games I played were the Oracle games. And that actually gave me higher expectations than I should have had for the typical Game Boy title. But there's a lot of things in this game that it's just not that interesting of a game, even if mechanically it's very, very sound. So I'm going to say it's a 7.5 out of 10, which makes my job of ranking it very, very easy. And we will do that after the break. Okay, welcome back. Let's rank this bad boy. Because Oracle of Seasons is the only 7.5 on my list of Game Boy games that I've already reviewed, it makes it very easy to place where exactly it should go. And I'm not really going to deliberate or have a big spiel about it. So we'll just throw it right underneath Pokemon Puzzle Challenge, which has an 8 out of 10. And right above Game & Watch Gallery Uno, which has a 7 out of 10. And there you have it. Oracle of Seasons is the third best game currently on my Game Boy ranking. So for the sake of review, we will run through those rankings real quick from the bottom. At number 12, we have Shantae. At number 11, we have Wario Land 3. At number 10, we have Wario Land 2. At number 9, we have Mega Man Extreme 2. At number 8, we have Donkey Kong Land 2. At number 7, Mole Mania. At number 6, Game & Watch Gallery 3. At number 5, Game & Watch Gallery 2. At number 4, Game & Watch Gallery. At number 3, Oracle of Seasons, The Legend of Zelda, Oracle of Seasons, pardon me. Pokemon Challenge at number 2. Pokemon Puzzle Challenge, pardon me again, at number 2. And at number 1, we have Pokemon Blue. To those who listen to this episode, I would like to thank you. And I hope you listen to future episodes and perhaps past episodes as well. I hope to never be rid of you. And you never rid of me. I'm just kidding. Get rid of me if you want. Until then, though, have a God bless day. And look forward to the next show whenever it occurs. Take care.